Ladies and gentlemen, this is my great honor and a pleasure to welcome you at this meeting, which is, we could say, a prequel to this year's 12th edition of the Miłosz Festival, an international event, a celebration of poetry, and we begin with a journey to Ireland with Theo Dorgan and Katarzyna Piecuch, who will discuss poetry and traveling today. My name is Maria Świątkowska. I'm the manager of the festival, and I welcome you here in the Potocki Palace, and I invite you to all the remaining events of our festival and encourage you to check out our program. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor over to Ms. Bazarnik, who will tell us a little bit more about this great event.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much, Miłosz Festival, for welcoming us in this beautiful space to host a very special guest, Theo Dorgan, who is a distinguished poet, essayist, novelist, and writer from Ireland. We're very happy to welcome you here in Kraków. And I would like to mention the partners of this event, because bringing Theo over to Poland was possible. First of all, thanks to the generosity of the Irish Embassy, so we got funding from the Irish Studies program. Thank you very much. And also the Polish Association for Irish Studies, which is another partner. But there is also the third partner, the Jagiellonian University Program for Academic Excellence. So all these agencies combined have contributed to this meeting. Katarzyna Piecuch will say a few more words about our distinguished guest. So I'm giving the floor to you both, and there will be some poetry reading, there will be some questions, discussions, and you're all very welcome to join in and ask questions if you have any. The poems will be read in English by the poet himself, and in Polish in the translations by Katarzyna Piecuch and Kazimierz Fajfer, who is also with us. Both students of the Jagiellonian University. So welcome, Theo, welcome, Kasia, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Does it seem to work? Okay. So hello once again. Thank you for coming here and being willing to listen to both poetry reading and some discussion about poetry. Our guest was already introduced, but I will say a few more words about him, because he's not only a poet, he's also a prose writer, he's a traveler, he's a sailor, he's a librettist, he's a scholar, and, well, a translator also. We will talk about it later on. The poems we will read out loud today come specifically from his two collections, one of them from the 90s, The Ordinary House of Love, and some others from his more recent work, Nine Bright Shiners, and you will have a chance to listen, possibly spot some differences, get to know his work to some extent. And there will also be a part when we will ask some questions about poetry in general, about translation, about how translation and how writing interact with each other, and also about his approach to writing. So without further ado, I guess we can start with reading poetry, and then we'll move on to the part with questions. Okay.
Is this working? It is. Well, first of all, thank you for braving the heat and coming here on such a warm evening. It's not terribly comfortable. We discussed outside whether or not we should cut the reading short before you all expire in the heat. Thank you also for coming despite that dreadfully grim photograph of the poet that was on the program. I looked at it outside and I got a shock. I didn't realize I could look so severe. I can't remember when that photograph was taken, and apparently it's on the website. The first thing I do when I go home is take it down. It would frighten the children and the horses. Polish poetry is sacred in Ireland because of the particular friendship between Miłosz and Seamus Heaney, and the enormous inspiration that Szymborska gave to, in particular, to so many Irish women poets, just at the time when the old barriers to women writers were under severe and concerted assault. So it's, for many complex reasons, it's a great pleasure to be here, especially to be in Kraków. It's the first time in my life I've fallen in love with a city that isn't on the sea. That's a kind of a novelty for me, I must say. And I want to thank Katarzyna and both my translators, including Kazimierz. Is he here? Oh, he's minding his child. It's always a great honor and a surprise to be translated. And it's always a surprise, too, when people pick a program of poems, because sometimes you're confronted with poems you haven't seen for a very long time and literally have forgotten them. And I don't know how many poets I have here. I suspect quite a few. But those poets in the audience will know the phenomenon of coming across an orphaned poem and thinking, that's not bad. And then that terrible moment, did I copy it from someone to study, or did I write it? And you can't remember whether you wrote it or not. Some of these, I have to say, you chose poems that surprised me. But it's meeting old friends. Well, acquaintances in some cases. So the first poem you want to read is Almost, which is on page 57. Like proper professional poet, I put pieces of paper in the pages of the books so I could find them more easily, and then they all fell out because I turned the books upside down when I was running out of the hotel trying to be on time. So there'll be a little moment while I go searching for them. This is a poem called Almost. Is the sound okay at the back? Yeah. Stooping at night to shield a match from the street wind, or stopping to watch the dust lift from the cracks between paving stones. I see your feet pick crisp steps into the afternoon, a small pain twisted into your shoulders. A moment neither accepted nor refused. Though the match flares and goes out, though the dust hangs in my eye, I remain hunched, trapped in the dream of your small feet walking away, the look in your eye before you turned.
Okay, so now I will read the Polish translation. Niemal. Nocą pochylony, by przed ulicznym wiatrem zapałkę osłonić, albo zatrzymany, by popatrzeć na kurz wznoszący się ze szczelin w bruku. Widzę, jak w południe stawiasz kruche kroki, ze słabym bólem wkręconym w ramiona. Chwila niezaakceptowana, ani nieodrzucona, chociaż zapałka rozbłyska i gaśnie, chociaż kurz utyka mi w oku. Pozostaję zgarbiony, uwięziony we śnie, o Twoich drobnych, oddalających się stopach, o Twoim spojrzeniu, nim się odwróciłaś.
In the great airports of the world, we see the entire world, the Greeks called o kosmos, passes through, and we see people, and if you look very carefully, there's always a certain percentage of people who are clearly between countries, between worlds. Very often they're political exiles. And I had a great friend, Kader Asmal. He was a professor of law in Dublin. He was also the ANC representative for Europe. And we worked together for many years in the anti-apartheid movement. And when Mandela was finally freed, Kader was invited home to become a minister in the government. And I wrote this for him. It had a strange afterlife, but perhaps I won't detain you with the afterlife of the poem. Statement of the political exiles. If it takes anger, we will be angry. If it takes patience, we will be rock stubborn in the stream. If it means forced marches in the dead of night, look for us when the moon is down, one foot steady after the other. If it means prison, bind our wrists, take us. If it means beatings, we will break like reeds we will spring back after the storm has gone over. We can be silent in the airports, our songs locked in our hearts. We can be faceless in your cities, anonymous in your fields. We can dissolve like salt in the sea of tears. We can be sand drifting at the margins. If it takes all the aeons needed to crush carbon into diamond, hear us. Those rivers run in our blood. That garden was promised us before time began. Who owns the light? Who has charge of the air? If it takes anger, we will be angry. But in any case, believe us, we are surely going home. Can you make a bird fly backwards? Believe us, we are going to our home.
Yeah, and in Polish translation it is oświadczenie wygnańców politycznych. Jeśli potrzeba gniewu, będziemy gniewni. Jeśli potrzeba przebiegłości, bardzo dobrze, będziemy przebiegli. Jeśli potrzeba cierpliwości, będziemy jak kamienie, uparcie tkwiące na dnie strumienia. Jeśli oznacza to forsowne marsze, pod osłoną ciemnej nocy, wypatruj nas, gdy zajdzie księżyc, idących równo krok za krokiem. Jeśli oznacza to więzienie, skujcie nas i weźcie. Jeśli oznacza bicie, będziemy się łamać jak trzciny i jak trzciny podniesiemy się, gdy burza przeminie. Możemy milczeć na lotniskach, pieśni chowając w sercach. Możemy przemykać bez twarzy ulicami waszych miast, anonimowi w waszych polach. Możemy rozpuścić się jak sól w morzu łez. Możemy być piaskiem przez wiatr przesuwanym po wybrzeżach. Choćby to miało trwać eony, potrzebne, by z węgla wygniótł się diament. Usłyszcie nas. Te rzeki płyną w naszej krwi. Ten ogród był nam obiecany przed początkiem czasu. Kto posiada światło? Kto rządzi powietrzem? Jeśli potrzeba gniewu, będziemy gniewni. Ale niezależnie od wszystkiego, możecie nam wierzyć. Wracamy do domu. Czy można sprawić, by ptak poleciał do tyłu? Możecie nam wierzyć. Wracamy do domu.
I remember when I wrote that poem, we were all in shock that Mandela had been freed, that he was going home, because in so many of the campaigns we fight for, we don't ever really expect to be successful. You know, far too much of my life has been given over to political campaigns that do not succeed, but we keep coming forward. That's the thing. It was Winston Churchill who said, and there's a man with a lot to answer for, but it was Winston Churchill who said, democracy is the worst possible system of government until you consider the alternatives. And I think of that often when I pass. Our national parliament is situated between the National Library and the National Museum. And there's a fence of high metal bars between the library and the parliament. And one of my minor pleasures is to stand there and look at our rulers behind bars. For some reason it cheers me up. They're not the worst, but most of them, well, let's say they're not animated by a passion for democracy or a passion for us. Now that politics everywhere in the Western democracies has become a profession rather than based in the urge to serve or to contribute to the public good. But there are exceptions, thank God there are exceptions. So I shamelessly stole the title of this from Walter Benjamin, The Angel of History. I've told people the truth about this poem, that this actually happened. Very few people believe me, but that's the trouble with poetry. You tell people the truth and they don't want to believe it. In the Parliament House on Kildare Street, the lamps were burning. It was a winter night, the usual slant rain falling. I had paused to light up a cigarette, to watch the lone guard stamp her feet, blow uselessly into her cupped, gloved hands. In the colonnade of the National Library, a man was standing, a man neither old nor young, his head bare, half turned towards the lights in the Parliament House, the high blank windows. I saw him reach inside his long, loose coat, take out a notebook. I crossed the road, gathering my own long coat around me, stood in behind him, looked over his shoulder. He paid no heed. One after another, I saw him strike them out from a long list of names, senators, deputies, ministers. One after another, the names dissolved on the page, a scant dozen remaining. I watched him ink in a question mark after each of these, neat and precise. He put the book away, sliding it down carefully into a deep pocket. He turned and looked at me, nothing like pity in those hollow eyes. He sighed, then squared his shoulders, lifted his face to the rain, and was gone. Gone, as if he had never been. But I saw him. I know who he was. I witnessed that cold, exact cancellation. I walked on, walked home, thoughtful, afraid for my country. This is getting very grim, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that we'll switch it up to more optimistic.
I hope to live long enough to write a poem that will make people smile.
Yeah.
So far it hasn't happened. I skipped 2 poems in your list. We should do those. The question and going home.
Yeah, but maybe I will read the translation first.
Oh yes, of course.
So here's to Anioł Historii. W budynku parlamentu na Kildare Street paliły się światła. Była zimowa noc. Deszcz zacinał jak zawsze. Zatrzymałem się zapalić papierosa, poobserwować samotną strażniczkę tupiącą nogami, bezskutecznie chuchającą w złożone dłonie. Pod kolumnadą Biblioteki Narodowej stał człowiek. Ani stary, ani młody, z odkrytą głową. Na pół zwrócony w stronę świateł parlamentu, jego wysokich, pustych okien. Widziałem, jak z kieszeni długiego, luźnego płaszcza wyjął zeszyt. Przeszedłem przez ulicę, owijając się ciaśniej własnym długim płaszczem. Stanąłem za nim i zajrzałem mu przez ramię. Nie zwrócił uwagi. Widziałem, jak skreślał, jednego za drugim, z długiej listy nazwisk, senatorów, posłów, ministrów, imiona, jedno za drugim, znikały ze strony, aż ostał się tuzin. Widziałem, jak przy każdym z nich postawił znak zapytania, schludny i dokładny. Schował zeszyt, wsuwając go ostrożnie w głęboką kieszeń. Odwrócił się i spojrzał na mnie bez śladu litości w pustych oczach. Westchnął, rozprostował ramiona i wystawiwszy twarz na padające krople, zniknął. Zdawać się mogło, że nigdy nie istniał. Ale ja go widziałem. Wiem, kim on był. Byłem świadkiem tej zimnej, dokładnej kasacji. Ruszyłem dalej, do domu, zamyślony, pełen obaw o los mojego kraju.
It's fascinating listening to the sound. You know, it's familiar and alien at the same time. It's really quite a strange sensation. Should we do the question?
Yeah, we can return to the question, although it's not optimistic at all.
Well, we don't know yet. It's not over yet. It's not over yet. But when I was very, very young, 5, 6, 7, and somebody was explaining how laboratory experiments are conducted. And I had the terrifying thought, what if we're a laboratory experiment? What if life on this planet is an experiment conducted from, let's say, Sirius or Betelgeuse or one of the far galaxies? And then the thought disappeared. I think I had a few nights of nightmares about that as a child, about that. And then the thought disappeared. And it surfaced out of nowhere. Well, you can't say out of nowhere. It surfaced suddenly as this little poem, this very small little poem. It's called The Question. When the great ships come back, and come they will, when they stand in the sky all over the world, bright burnished suns by day, radiant cathedrals in the night, how shall we answer the question? What have you done with what was given you? What have you done with the blue, beautiful world?
Pytanie.
It never occurs to us that we may have to answer for what we've done.
Yeah. Okay, so pytanie. A gdy powrócą wspaniałe statki, bo powrócą z pewnością, a gdy zawisną na niebie ponad całym światem, za dnia na błysk wypolerowany słońca, nocą świecące katedry, jak wtedy odpowiemy na pytanie, co uczyniliście z tym, co wam dano? Co uczyniliście z pięknym, błękitnym światem?
You put poems out in the world and you have no idea where they'll finish up. I have an online subscription to the English newspaper, The Guardian, and I opened up half awake. You know, I was reading the papers before I fully wake up so as not to despair entirely. And there was a photograph of that poem on a banner hanging in Trafalgar Square. So I thought, it's a lesson for poets, you know, write the poem and let it go, let it find its own place. This poem is called Going Home. Some of these haven't been published yet. Well, they haven't been collected in books. Manos Katsakopoulos was a Greek engineer, sailor, possibly the grumpiest man I ever met in my life. He was always complaining, but he had a heart of gold, as is often the case with grumpy people. Not always. In my case, when I'm grumpy, I'm just grumpy. I don't have a heart of gold. But Manos, you know, sometimes that moment where you discover when somebody dies how fond of them you were, and you wish that you told them. So this is to Manos, and it's called Going Home. Come, Capitan, we've a fair wind for Icaria, a sound boat and a good crew, you know them well. Friends of your youth, good companions all. Give me your hand and step aboard. The night is coming on, we've a star or two to steer by. Come sit here by the helm and take your ease. Southeast to clear the roads, then round to the north. How many times have we made this course on good days and bad, all these long years? Dear friend, just think of it. So many journeys, such treasure of memories stored in our bones. How fortunate we have been in our wanderings over the broad sea, the fruitful, fragrant earth. And what have we learned? That all voyages have a beginning and an end. Just so. They will be lighting the lamps in Agios Kyrikos, setting the tables, gathering to the tavernas, and I to the harbour entrance, the incoming craft. A fine welcome they'll have for you. Home at last to a berth under the Aetheras, under the olives. Friend, we are at your service. Give the command.
Wracając do domu. Chodź, kapitanie, wiatr sprzyja nam do Ikarii. Statek jest solidny, a załoga mocna. Znasz ich dobrze, przyjaciół twej młodości, każdy z nich zacnym kompanem. Podaj mi dłoń i wstąp na pokład. Noc zapada, nad nami gwiazda lub dwie, by nimi się kierować. Chodź, usiądź tu u steru i odpocznij. Na południowy wschód i pustym szlakiem zwrot na północ. Ile razy płynęliśmy tym kursem w dni dobre i złe przez te wszystkie lata? Drogi przyjacielu, tylko o tym pomyśl. Ile podróży, ile skarbów pamięci złożonych w naszych kościach. Jak szczęśliwi byliśmy w naszych tułaczkach po planszy morza, pachnącej, żyznej ziemi. I czegoż się nauczyliśmy? Że każda podróż ma swój początek i koniec. Właśnie tego. Wkrótce zapalą lampy w Aios Kirikos, ustawią stoły, zbiorą się w tawernach, zwracając wzrok ku wejściu do portu, nadciągającym okrętom. Gorące zgotują ci przyjęcie, gdy wreszcie wrócisz do domu, na hamak pod atrasem, pod drzewami oliwnymi. Przyjacielu, jesteśmy do twych usług. Rozkazuj.
We have the illusion that at any given moment, that we're all living in the same moment. But of course we're not. There are so many different kinds of time. So many different people are in different times. That is, maybe they're in one place, but we can be in very different times while all in the same place, or ostensibly all in the same place. All time is not the same time. She wasn't begging, not exactly, just sitting out of the flow. She wasn't sitting, not exactly. She was just there, out of the flow. I wasn't hurrying, not exactly, just walking, going with the flow. Well, not just walking. I was worrying my way through the flow. She looked up and smiled. Just that, smiled. And I smiled back. Of course I did. I reached in my pocket, but she shook her head. She held my eyes and let her look fall out of the hurting world, out of the flow.
Cały czas nie jest tym samym czasem. Nie żebrała, nie do końca. Po prostu siedziała poza nurtem. Nie siedziała, nie do końca. Po prostu tam była, poza nurtem. Nie spieszyłem się, nie do końca. Po prostu szedłem razem z nurtem. Właściwie nie tyle szedłem, co zamartwiałem się swą drogą z nurtem. Spojrzała w górę i obdarzyła mnie uśmiechem. Po prostu obdarzyła mnie uśmiechem, który ja odwzajemniłem. Oczywiście, że tak. Sięgnąłem do kieszeni, ale ona pokręciła głową i długo patrzyła mi w oczy, nim odwróciła wzrok od tego bolesnego świata, od jego nurtu.
It's a very short one. It'll go by very quickly, so pay attention. Actually, I don't mind. It's just we've reached that point in the reading where I feel that out of ordinary human decency, I should say, if you feel an irresistible urge to have a small nap or a little snooze, please feel free. I was that soldier, I understand. Police check. In order to frighten us, he reads out a list of names. Victor Jara, Salvador Allende. In order to sober him, we recite a list of names. Salvador Allende, Victor Jara.
Kontrola policyjna. Żeby nas przestraszyć, odczytuje nam listę nazwisk. Victor Jara, Salvador Allende. Żeby go otrzeźwić, recytujemy listę nazwisk. Salvador Allende, Victor Jara.
That's one of those ones, you either get it or you don't, and I can't possibly explain it. Why did you pick that?
I think it's interesting because it's so short. Like usually your poems are quite lengthy, at least many of them.
You just needed a break and you took a short one.
I mean, yeah.
My beloved wife is almost certainly the best poet of her generation. I commend her to you, Katarzyna Piecuch. And she had a poem on the curriculum for the final examination in school. And some little girls in the park where we live came and they said, Paula, is that really your poem on the exam? She said, yes. Oh, we love it. Oh, thanks very much. Yeah, it's lovely and short. And this is a woman who has been covered with honours, and that is still her favourite review. The honesty of kids. Family tree. You know, Nadezhda Mandelstam, her two great volumes of biography, Hope Against Hope and Hope Abandoned. That's just in case any of you go, where did he get that from? That phrase comes into it, right? So I'm just owning up to the thefts. Was it Eliot said, bad poets borrow, great poets steal? Well, it's not just great poets who steal, I steal as well. You know. Family tree. Under the bone-white moon of Granada, I name you Federico Garcia Lorca, who lived and died for love. Under the golden mosaic of Ravenna, I name you Dante Alighieri, hopelessly importuning your Beatrice. Nadezhda Mandelstam I name, who hoped against hope and then abandoned hope, but never her undying love. In the darkest of nights, these flames will keep on burning. No storm, no steel, no cold can quench these flames. One after another, I light my candles to human love, to all those in the wind, blown through the world like leaves, to those gone to the bonfires, the furnace of history, to all those who struggled for bread a moment in this life.
Drzewo genealogiczne. Pod białym jak kość księżycem Grenady wzywam cię, Federico Garcia Lorca, który żyłeś i umarłeś dla miłości. Pod złotymi mozaikami Ravenny wzywam cię, Dante Alighieri, bez nadziei narzucający się swej Beatrice. Nadezhdę Mandelstam wzywam, wbrew rozsądkowi żywiącą nadzieję, którą w końcu porzuciła, w przeciwieństwie do nieśmiertelnej miłości. Nawet w najciemniejszą z nocy te ognie będą płonąć. Żadna burza, żadna stal i żaden chłód nie zdoła ich ugasić. Jedną za drugą zapalam świece na cześć ludzkiej miłości, na cześć tych wszystkich, rzucanych jak liście na wietrze, na cześć rzuconych w ogień w piecu historii, na cześć wszystkich, co muszą się trudzić dla kawałka chleba.
And another mercifully short poem. So catch it as it flies past like a swallow. It's called Café. In the entire boom and confusion of the café, one point of stillness. A man reading over and over the last letter received from his dead father.
Kawiarnia. W hałasie i zamieszaniu kawiarni jedyna ostoja spokoju. Mężczyzna w kółko czytający. Ostatni list od zmarłego ojca.
Sooner after, it made its way into a book, so it has to be allowed to stand, but I took a sudden revulsion against the fashion for haiku, because I'm not entirely convinced that the form carries from Japanese into English or into any other, but I'd perpetrated these before I had time to draw them back. In fact, the only haiku I've kept is called, would you like to hear it? Wedding Gift. The bright green toaster you gave us keeps popping up in conversation. Right, okay, I withdraw that as well, okay. But as you've translated these, I'll read them. It's called 5 Haiku for You. Seagulls overhead, bank, dip, fall away downwind, they make one bright shape. You want to translate? Do we do them one at a time?
I mean, we can, I guess.
Yeah, please.
So the first of 5 haiku for you. Nad brzegiem mewy, opadające z wiatrem, tworzą wspólny kształt.
Look, short daffodils. The black dog is curious. North wind holds its breath.
Spójrz, rząd żonkili, ciekawość czarnego psa, wiatr wstrzymał oddech.
Bread in the toaster, tea leaves swelling in the pot, chink of 2 white cups.
Kromka w tosterze, listki na dnie czajniczka, szczękanie kubków.
The shape of your foot pressed into grains of white sand. World has come inside.
Kształt twojej stopy, odbity w białym piasku, świat wszedł do środka.
Crisp pillows, soft light. You stretch gently, you settle. Click, the world expands.
Poduszka, światło, przeciągasz się, rozsiadasz, świat się rozszerza.
See why I've abandoned haiku? It's no, right. Okay, speaking to my father. Yeah. So, I grew up the eldest of a very large family. My father was a factory worker. My mother had worked in a factory before they married. And what they wanted for their children was that we should have an education. And it wasn't instrumental. They wanted us to pursue education as far as we wanted, and then, and this is the strain, to do whatever we wanted with our lives. They didn't want us to be lawyers or doctors or civil servants or anything. Just, we will do this for you, and then you make your life. And the older I get, the more extraordinary I find that graciousness of the heart. But it didn't come from nothing. They had to make enormous sacrifices for us. And there must have been times, I know there were times, when my father in particular must have felt he had sold his soul, that he'd emptied out his life for us. And there are times, and any writer, musician, painter will tell you, there are times when we feel that what we do is meaningless, repetitive drudgery. Because, speaking for the poets I know, every time you write a poem you realize it's not good enough. This is the truth. We live our entire lives hoping before we die to write the poem. Everything else is nearly at best. So there are times when that manifests as a kind of desolation. But just as my father did, we go on. What does Beckett say? I can't go on. I will. I'll go on. And I'm always fascinated when people say that poets don't understand ordinary life. In the first place, there's no such thing as ordinary life. But we all have the common sense, I think, that life is meaningful and meaningless at the same time. But we go on. The great French poet Paul Éluard says, il y a des temps qu'il n'y a que le dur désir de durer. There are times when there is only the dur desire to endure. And I think that might be the mindset I was in when I wrote this poem. But it took me a long time to realize it was a poem of love and gratitude to my father. There's a companion poem, let me hasten to add, to my mother, to whom I am equally grateful. It just happens to be that it's not in the book that you worked on. So, what page is that on? Sorry, Jesus, 86. Some of these poems I wrote a very long time ago. I don't recognize the man who wrote them. He seems so far back. So it's How should I now call up that man my father, who year after weary year went off to work, buried his heart beneath a weight of duty, buried himself early so that we might live? How should I sit here and explain to his shade that, yes, this is the work I do you died for. This is the use I make of all that sacrifice. I move the words as you moved heavy tires. True, there is no sickening stench of rubber, no heat from the curing pans, no rage at management, choked back by need as much as pride. But Father, the range of uselessness is wide. Often as I grew slowly, you'd let slip a word, a helpless gesture, or a look that shook me to the roots. I'd sense the void you stubbornly, heroically sweated back. Now I have everything you lacked. Above all, freedom to shape the workload for the day. It sounds like freedom, doesn't it? The truth is, I hate the shift work just as much as you did. There are days lately, as I thicken in years, when I feel your sinews shift inside my frame. I catch a look of yours in the mirror, shaving, mild, skeptical, weary, a bit resigned, but something else too, your athlete's way of planting the feet carefully when troubled, shoulders square to the blow that may come, ready and fit to defend what you hold dear. What troubled you most? The question shies away when I stab with my pen, clumsy as ever. I don't even rightly know what troubles me, ignorant as when I rode upon your knee. And what would you make of me, I wonder, sitting here long after midnight, searching for the words to bring you back, soliciting the comfort of your shade for the odd, useless creature that you made. Here is the end of all that education. The void is as close to me as it ever was to you. I make poems as you and Rose made children, blindly, because I must. Father, comrade, the same anger with the world, but not your patience moves me. I make you this, a toy in words to reintroduce myself and to ask, what must I do to be your child again?
Mówiąc do ojca, jak przywołać teraz tego mężczyznę, który był moim ojcem, który z roku na rok rzucał się w wir pracy, grzebiąc swoje serce pod ciężarem odpowiedzialności, odchodząc przedwcześnie, żebyśmy my mogli żyć? Jak siedząc tutaj wytłumaczyć jego cieniowi, że oddał swe życie za to, żebym robił to, co robię, że tak odpłacam się za jego ofiarę i że przestawiam słowa tak, jak on przenosił ciężkie opony? To prawda, że nie czuję nigdy mdlącego smrodu gumy, ani gorąca bijącego z utwardzonych metali, ani złości na zarząd, który kazałaby mi zdusić tak konieczność, jak i duma. Ale, ojcze, nie ma kresu to poczucie bezużyteczności. Często, kiedy dorastałem, z twoich ust wymykało się jakieś słowo, dłonie wykonywały bezradny gest, a z oczu wyzierało spojrzenie, które wstrząsało mną do głębi. I czułem wtedy oddech pustki, którą starałeś się heroicznie i rozpaczliwie odepchnąć. Posiadam teraz wszystko, czego ty nie miałeś. Przede wszystkim wolność do wyznaczania sobie dziennego nakładu pracy. Czyż nie brzmi to jak prawdziwa wolność? Prawda jest taka, że podobnie jak ty nie znoszę pracy na zmianę. Teraz, gdy przybywa mi lat, zdarzają się dni, kiedy czuję ruch twoich ścięgien pod moją skórą, a w lustrze miga mi twoja twarz w trakcie golenia, łagodna, ironiczna, zmęczona, nieco zrezygnowana. Ale jest też coś jeszcze. Twoja sportowa maniera ostrożnego stawiania kroków, kiedy przygniatał cię jakiś ciężar. Ramiona naprężone w gotowości na cios. dłonie napięte, by bronić tego, co najcenniejsze. Co dręczy cię najbardziej? To pytanie zamiera i cofa się, gdy próbuję dźgnąć je piórem, niezdarny jak zawsze. Sam nie wiem tak naprawdę, co mnie dręczy. Nieporadny jak wtedy, gdy huśtałeś mnie na kolanach. Zastanawiam się, co byś o mnie pomyślał, widząc mnie, kiedy siedzę tutaj po północy, szukając słów, które mogłyby cię wskrzesić, zastępując kojącą bliskość twojego cienia dziwnym i zbłąkanym kształtem. Oto nastąpił koniec całej mojej edukacji. Mam tę pustkę na wyciągnięcie ręki, podobnie jak kiedyś ty. Piszę wiersze o miłości, tak jak ty i Rose płodziliście dzieci. Na oślep, kierowany nadzieją i zaufaniem i ponieważ muszę. Ojcze, mój przyjacielu, prowadzi mnie ta sama złość, którą czułeś, ale brak mi twojej cierpliwości. Zbudowałem dla ciebie ze słów tę zabawkę, żeby ponownie ci się przedstawić i zapytać, co muszę zrobić, by ponownie zostać twoim dzieckiem. So that was our introduction containing poetry reading, and we will now move on to some questions.
Maybe this is the point at which we could say, anybody who wishes to escape, take your moment now.
Yeah, that's a perfect time.
You're too slow, you're too slow. You're stuck now again.
But there's still time to run.
I'm just scared of questions. Go on. Do your worst.
Yeah, I will do my best. Okay, so personally, I was really interested in your approach to how politics and poetry work together and may work together. And I also read one of your interviews to a Spanish journal from 2019, where you made the claim that, in a sense, poetry is always a rebel act, not for the sake of being contrarian, but because the narratives of those in power, whether it is educational power, or political power, or medical power, are not to be absolutely trusted. You must question them, and the way to question them is through language. What do you think about the claim that you made, and also about the claim that everything is political, including art and poetry? And following the quote I have just read, would you say that your poems are politically or socially or both engaged in any matter you sympathize with or feel the need to defend, or would you rather describe them as neutral?
That's about 17 different questions in one.
I can divide it into sections.
Yeah, I'm always horrified when I hear an interview quoted back to me, because at any given moment what you say in an interview is what you feel like at the time, and if you're feeling dyspeptic or hungry or thirsty or hungover, you may say things that you would not say in a more considered way. I don't see, you see, where do I begin with this? We hold language in common, but we all have different perspectives on it. And the professional political class in any era and of any ideology understands that whoever controls language controls the world. So you don't have a war on the borders of the Ukraine, you have a special military operation. So if you have a special military operation, you can't have a domestic anti-war movement, right? So how you phrase a thing is always an effort to control. And the purpose, the poet's purpose, or the poet's responsibility, is to subvert the co-option of language. Because we should be able to say, I love you, or I will do this, or I do not agree with that, and those words should mean what they mean. When we say democracy, we should mean democracy. It's not a counter, like a chess piece on a board. Words have their own internal, historical accumulated weight and meaning and responsibility. So The business of poetry is to clear the wells, to let words live in their proper and full meaning. And when words accumulate in a poem, they necessarily have a stance. So if you take that little poem about Salvador Allende and Victor Jara, a Chilean policeman in the time of Pinochet would have said, remember Allende, remember Jara, and what he would have meant was, we can kill you. But somebody in the resistance would have said, remember Allende, remember Jara, meaning we will resist you. So a lot depends on how you frame the words and mean it. I have destroyed, torn up, burned, shredded, anything I ever wrote as a deliberate political polemic, because it's not a poem. If you suborn a poem, or if you pretend that a programmatic, polemical piece of writing is a poem, you're doing a disservice to polemic and to poetry. But politics makes itself felt in the poem because my absolute unshakable instinct is always with the poor and the powerless. Some of it is to do, I grew up poor and my people were powerless, but I got language. And if you live in language as a living, meaningful thing, then you have a responsibility to it because it vivifies you, it gives you life. And you have a responsibility to use it well for those who are denied power through language. So in that sense, all art is political. It speaks for what is irreducible and will not be bullied in the human condition. That doesn't mean that when you're political to it, it's necessarily ideological. I think Mayakovsky became a weaker poet when he became programmatically political. The great Scottish poet Hugh MacDiarmid, his worst poems are the ones where he was trying to promote a politics, a political ideology through the poems. But we've come through a time where a love poem is an act of resistance. We still perhaps live in that, where to speak, to yield to another, to yield importance to the life of another, is in itself a political stance. To say that our world is burning is a political stance. It may be simply an observation. I'm not explaining this very well because my hope is that the poems explain themselves. And I'm anxious when people try to put, hedge poems in with critical concepts. But, the word polity, it comes from polis, meaning the people, the city, in some senses, from the Greek root. All poets have a responsibility to keep a clear eye on the long accumulated history and usage of a word, of its etymology, of its uses, and the ways in which the word has been abused, and the very act of curating language, of allowing language, so to speak itself, is a political stance, because that's a refusal of co-option. So sometimes if a poem touches overtly on politics, that's very often on the surface, like The Angel of History. I wrote that because I was standing in the colonnade of the National Library and this figure stood in beside me. And I knew who he was. And while he wasn't actually physically writing in a notebook, it was the Angel of History looking at our Parliament and saying, none of these concern me. None of these have stood forward enough, deeply rooted in the human heart to speak for what is best for the polis. And so I just wrote it down. I tell young poets in workshops, and if there are 12 in the workshop, maybe 2 will believe me. And I care for those two, because they will be poets. I say, we don't write the poems write us. Our responsibility is to learn the craft. So when the poem is given, to find it in its fullness and make a little vessel to hold it, so when you put it on the stream of language, it'll hold together. But it's true, I said, and it's a very unpopular view. We've lost the ancient distinction between verse and poetry, primary and secondary imagination. There's an enormous amount of will, intellectual cleverness in verse. And now, because we've become lazy, we call those poems. To me, a poem is something that has an irreducible sense of otherness at the heart of it. Something that stirs parts of consciousness we rarely pay attention to, but would perish without. And I think that's the same place that a true politics comes from. And by a true politics, I mean a sense that nothing is good for me if it isn't good for all of us. Because if we're getting out of this life, it's all of us or none of us. There will be no reserved lifeboats. It's all of us or none of us. And every malign political act diminishes the human in places far, far away from the immediate conflict, because it reduces our hope, our capacity for hope for the human. This is getting suspiciously like a sermon. I should stop, shouldn't I? I'm actually trying to avoid the question, I realize now, because I don't know. I mean, we could have picked a completely different set of poems, and you'd have to ask a very different question. You happen to pick ones that touch on a politics. I mean, I have my own politics, quite frankly, but I'm always astonished when people assign a political meaning to what I thought was a love poem. Maybe love poems are political. Maybe they're the ultimate political poems. I said earlier I'd want to write just one poem before I die. And I would really like that to be a love poem, because I have been blessed in my life and I would like to acknowledge it. And that will be the most political thing I'll ever write if I'm ever given it. Have we exhausted the topic enough without bringing any light or clarity to this answer?
Yeah, the question was exhausted, and your answer was really well thought. No, it was like a sermon, but a very interesting one. You rarely hear that kind of sermons in church, actually. So
I wouldn't know. It's been a very long time.
I mean, it also has been a long time for me, but I remember some sermons, and yours was incredibly interesting. Yeah. But I have an additional question to what you have already said.
Okay.
It's about the language, because you focus on it quite a lot in your answer. And you also spoke up about your working class origin and background. Yeah. And it also features in your poetry, as we could all see and hear. So would you say that it is your desire, it is your intention to make your poetic voice more democratic, in a sense that you do not tend to overcomplicate, in a way, some messages, some things, but rather rely on simplicity and on heartfelt messages, so that people from different backgrounds can enjoy and can understand the poetry you write and the message you want to convey?
You know, the implicit in your question is an idea that the bourgeoisie are incapable of speaking simply, which I can't accept, or that people from a working class background necessarily speak simply, which also je n'accepte pas. Okay. No, I think what it is, I mean, these are convenient and, you know, sociologically important distinctions between classes and so on, and we all understand that. You know, class is a sociological construct. It's easier and more productive to say there are those with power and those without power. And if you grow up in an environment where all of your neighbors, all the girls and boys you go to school with, are being told by the machine that they don't matter, that they're there only, their destiny is menial work and so on. If you have a spark of rebellion in you, that's going to deeply upset you. And I was very deeply upset at 6, 7, 8 years of age at the attitude of our teachers of our school, the implicit. And I realized that, I mean, to us, somebody driving a truck had a good job. Somebody who was a plumber, someone who was a carpenter had a good job. They were secure, they were financially secure. And then there were people who were working casually, and then there were people who had no work at all. We knew there were gradations in poverty. But we also knew that poverty is not necessary. It's not a necessary and irreducible thing in human life. And I learned very, very young that you can literally talk your way out of it. You can take command of language and you can break the chains if you command language. That's why reading was so important. It teaches you what words can do. And by the time I was 9 or 10, I was the smallest boy in my class, but the teachers were afraid of me. I see that now. I was afraid of them then, but now I see, looking back, they were afraid of me because I had the words to tell them who they were and what they were doing to us. And so that was an early encounter, and necessarily a political encounter with language. But that became subsumed into the more interesting question of what is the relationship between language and the imagination. And I remember being complained in my university department. I was teaching MA night students, and I was teaching them I wanted them to think about how strange language is. So do you know Shakespeare's play Hamlet? Yes, we all know Hamlet, yes. So I was saying to them, I said, look, imagine you're at home. It's a winter's night. Your feet to the fire, a glass of whiskey on the table, the dog beside you, and you're there, and you were weeping for Ophelia. Your heart is broken by the fate of Ophelia. Are you with me so far? Yeah? I said, what is the connection between your genuine sense of grief and the fact that 400 years ago, a man in his late 40s, half drunk on cheap rot-gut wine, staggered home from the Mermaid Tavern, took the feather of a bird, dipped it in a paste made from carbon and berry juice, and scratched on a piece of dried sheepskin marks that you would not now be able to read, and there is a direct connection between that moment and you sitting with your feet to the fire, the dog beside you, a glass of whiskey in your hand, weeping for somebody who never existed. The students, they were all teachers. They complained me to my professor. They said, what has that to do with anything? And I said, God. And of course it has to do with everything. You know, I'm just sitting here and I'm moving my tongue and my lips, and air is moving. And air is moving, and it's striking the tympanum in everybody's ears. And somehow, we are connecting. Words. We're making little phonemes, and phonemes carry meaning in the material, physical world. I find that extraordinary. I really do. I find telepathy or mutual understanding easier to understand than communicating by black marks on a white page or by moving the air and striking people's ears. I find telepathy easier to understand, you know. And so once you realize that language is a living force and power in the world, you necessarily have to ask, who has control of it? And then you understand, I can take control. I can take back control. And then some of us, a small few of us, have the bizarre life that we hear poems in the air, and we listen, and we write them down. We take dictation and we write them down. That's my view of poetry. I should say, being scrupulous, it's a very minority view now, because everybody wants to be clever and make poems, and I insist on the distinction between poetry and verse. But I'm not interested in converts, and I don't want to persuade anyone. Either you get that or you don't. If you do, you're in my gang. If you don't, I don't care. You know, I really don't care. It's not a terrible thing to say, isn't it? But when I say I don't care, I mean, I don't need to persuade anybody. Either you get it or you don't. Samuel Coleridge says, but these things will by few be understood and by few are granted. It's like a theory of music to the deaf or a theory of colour to the blind. And that's what I think, but it doesn't bother me if nobody else thinks like that. It really doesn't bother me, you know. You make poems, you put them out there and let them find their own way in the world. I'm scared of these little baby poets who are talking about their careers. A career in poetry. You have a life in poetry, not a career in poetry. Jesus' sake, God. Sorry, don't get me started. Come on, ask me something that'll wake them up again. They're all falling asleep.
Yeah. So moving on from language and from politics, we can talk a little bit of mythology, because we haven't included any poem that features mythology per se, but it's one of Theo's main interests and main inspirations behind his writing. He writes a lot about traveling, about sailing, about voyages in general. And we know how close Greek mythology is connected to those specific themes. And so we can move on to the question of Greek mythology. Since it lies at the heart of your poetry, and for instance, in one of your more recent collections, Orpheus, which draws on the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. But the question I want to ask is more general in nature, and it has to do with the question of what is so meaningful, so powerful in mythology, in Greek myths, that makes it such a powerful tool for constant revisions, constant reinterpretations. And would you also say that a recent revival of interest in Greek mythology, which can be seen not only in poetry, but also in children's literature, in films, in pop culture, is connected to some escapist drive, or maybe it is actually through drawing parallels between the mythological realm and art realm, that one can give a more accurate, more serious, more complete and nuanced outlook on the contemporary world.
A lot of questions in there as well, aren't there? Well, I suppose there are a number of ways of looking at it. The fascination of myth for me is that the armature of a myth endures, with nobody making any particular effort to make sure it endures. And myth endures under its own enthusiasm. And the armature, the internal architecture of a myth is such that it can withstand and sustain successive interpretations in different phases of our civilization. We were given, for instance, two stories when we were children. The myth of Lot's wife, she's leaving, I can't remember, is it Sodom or Gomorrah? Let's say one or other. And she's told, don't look back or you'll turn into a pillar of salt. And so there's that, the key thing there is, don't look back. And she looked back, and she turned into a pillar of salt. Orpheus and Eurydice, similar story. He can save her if he doesn't look back. Okay? And this is presented to us because we come out of a patriarchal culture as Orpheus, the hero. He goes all the way down into hell to save Eurydice, and he blows it at the last minute by looking back to make sure she's following him. But what if she went down of her own accord? What if she needed to go down into the dark to make her own soul, as so many of us have had to? You go down into the dark of yourself to find what you can find, to deal with it, and you come back again. It's the psychotherapeutic journey. And so if that's the circumstance, then he's interfering with the process. He's actually getting in her way. Right? Now, the same myth, Orpheus goes down for Eurydice, turns and she stays. The same myth carries two apparently contradictory interpretations. But that's what they are, they're interpretations. Orpheus, it was said of Orpheus that he could make stones sing, that the animals could speak to him. Well, we've learned complex ways of communicating with other creatures on the planet. We know in the science of sonics, as a branch of physics, that we can make stones sing. You know, you can make stones sing. Just direct the correct kind of gradation, that in fact, everything we call material is in fact energy and vibration in different wavelengths. So, surprisingly, it is possible to make stones sing. I mean, the speakers here, they're disturbing the air because electrical currents are being turned on and off, and they're making it move, and they're making air move and impinge on our eardrums the exact same way we respond to a voice. So you can find, if you look from the correct angle, that buried in the myths are simple statements that continually repeat themselves and make themselves known. On the level of the affections and feelings, certain situations repeat themselves over and over in the human experience. We've been taught, because experience has been turned into a commodity, that the most important thing in the world is to be different. And it means we've lost the sense of what we have in common. Most people, seeing an adult strike a child, will come to the child's defense. There are simple, straightforward human situations which the classical Greeks codified and made stories of. But they made the stories so that certain situations can be transmitted and responses to the situations can be transmitted. And it happens that those hold up. They hold up. So the return, as you put it, the return to mythology is taking a breath again and stating certain key truths about the human condition. I mean, the Greek idea of hubris, I'm sure Vlad the Mad is sitting in the Kremlin and having intimations of the price to be paid for hubris right now. You know, it was a very interesting concept, hubris. It's not in any culture before the classical Greeks, but now it's become part of our, if you like, our intellectual DNA. You know, chancing your arm, pushing your luck, all of those things. So really, the myths aren't colourful add-ons to life. What we call the myths are simple, basic stories at the heart of the variety of stories we tell ourselves. You'll get idiots from Hollywood, you know, trying to make films about the Spartans, which are ahistorical and absurd, about all these beefcake men, big swords, tough guys. And that's just rubbish. I mean, that's just bullshit, really. But we repeat our stories over and over again because there are only a small handful of stories. We just have varieties now. As an aside, I was delighted when Bob Dylan was given the Nobel Prize. It was very interesting in Ireland. About 85% of the poets were surveyed, and 85% of us thought it was a marvelous thing. And the ones who didn't, well, I mean, they had such a notion of themselves. I've written a few poems, but they're poems, so I'm superior. Dylan is the Orpheus of the late 20th century. He's the lyric singer of truths. He marries music and words in a way that lifts and shifts the human heart. And we'd almost forgotten that moving the heart is what it's about. You know, the most clever verse in the world, if it doesn't touch the heart, is an absolute waste of everybody's time. I believe that. Dylan, more than anyone else, restored the lyric, the Orphic, to the tradition. I find Szymborska, for instance, an entirely lyrical poet. There is a marvelous liturgical lyric in Miłosz, you know, buried underneath it. Derek Walcott, another novelist, has made a beautiful music from the patois of his native St. Lucia and the Elizabethan English that he learned in the Shakespearean sonnets as a child in school. But it's the music that stirs the heart. That's what matters. I dislike intensely the way they teach poetry in our schools at home because they teach it by paraphrase. And the giveaway phrase is, well, what the poet is trying to say is, no, the poet's just said it. I tell you an aside story. This is nothing to, we've gone a long way from myth now, but my beloved got a letter once from a young man who was studying to become a Catholic priest. And he said, you like this? As part of our formation, we are trying to understand what it is that Irish women want. And my response to that is, good luck. You know? To that end, I am studying 7 of your poems as follows. I wonder, would you be so kind as to tell me in your own words what those poems mean? And I begged her to write back and say, dear Blad, thank you for your letter. Those are my own words. You know? The idea that you can paraphrase a poem to extract the meaning, as if the architecture of sound in the poem isn't part of the meaning, as if the pacing of the poem isn't part of the meaning. We understand that in songs. You know, we understand in songs that there is a relationship between the rhythm, the meter of the song, the key the song is in, and the meaning. And, you know, you can be moved to tears by the repetition of a banal phrase. Look at Dido's aria, Remember Me. When Curite Canova sings Remember Me in Dido and Aeneas, you know, Purcell's Dido and Aeneas, Jesus, I cry every single time I hear it, you know, even though I'm anticipating it. But we have kind of forgotten that that should also be true in poetry, that the cadence of the voice is part of the meaning. So when Dylan got the Nobel, I said, yes, that's one for the Orpheus. That's one for Orpheus, you know. Imagine asking, what do Irish women want? He's hoping to understand what Irish women want. I thought that was the funniest. Are you going to ask me another question? Are we going to have mercy on these poor people and allow them to escape?
So we will close the meeting with...
Unless anybody has a question they
Yeah.
really feel they must ask. Oh, here we go.
Since you have been talking so much about the connection between poetry and music, can you tell us a little bit about how you worked on the libretto and what was this piece about?
I've done 3. One was, and it's a very short answer. I write the words and then I give it to the composer and the composer finds the music. So it's really simple. And people think it must be a very complex collaboration. No. But what I do is I write for the ear. I write for the speaking voice of the whoever is speaking. In Jason and the Argonauts, it's Orpheus. I co-opt him onto the Argo when Jason goes off in search of the Golden Fleece. And the simple device there is when they're rowing, it's a pentameter. And when they're sailing, it's a hexameter. Because rowing, the pentameter is the rhythm of rowing a galley. The hexameter is when the sail is pulling. And so I play with that, but it's Orpheus tells the story. So I wrote it so that when Orpheus is telling his story, it's dignified and formal, but it's also a version of colloquial, right? So that allows him to judge the others. In Sappho's Daughter, it was pure dictation. I was sitting on a balcony on the island of Chios and I got the first half of it, this fellow whispering in my ear. Because Sappho has a daughter, Claes. There is no story whatever of a father. But he came and he muttered in my ear and I wrote him into the story. He was a shipwrecked sailor who landed on Chios and she thought, yeah, you'll do. Give me a child. And then she threw him off the island. That, by the way, is exactly what happened, even though they don't have it in the history books, I can tell you. But I wrote that because he needed to be, or it came through to me that he was clipped, elliptical, terse, macho guy. And she's much more yearning and beguiling and magical. So I have to trust the composer to find that, to find an answer to those moods. And in the latest one, Erdo and Amergine, you have a Galician coming to say, my brother will follow me with an army. And you have the princess poet of the Tuatha De Danann and the then indigenous Irish accepting we will not stand against that army, we will go underground, but in time we will come back. And so the voices are quite distinct, but they're both tinged with regret, but acceptance of the inevitable. So then Cullum, who's a genius, and the composer, simply, I trust him to find an answer in music to those moods. And he does brilliantly. Improves the thing no end. But it's just I trust him. Just give him the words. And what he says is he couldn't do the music if the words weren't right. And I never ask him what he means by if the words weren't right. If he says they're right, that's all I need to know. Otherwise, I'd only cut the ground out from under myself. No?
Anyone willing to ask something?
Actually, I would like to.
Do you want a microphone?
I mean, I believe it might be a bit maybe simple-minded question, but when you've created your poems over the years, in how big of a part have you considered the people? In how big of a part you have written the poems only for yourself to understand, and in how big of a part you have written those poems for the people to feel and understand?
You mean, do I feel a sense of responsibility to people?
Somewhat, because let's say there are some universal ideas that people will usually get, that they will understand, and at least in my experience, there are some ideas that only a poet may understand, only a poet, due to how his own nature works, may grasp. And I just wonder if, when you have created those poems, did you consider the people you were creating them for, or did you basically just write it only for yourself and for your own emotions?
I hope you'll understand the terms in which I wish to answer that. I write the poem to answer to the poem. The poem, it's like, you know, you hear a snatch of music in a far-off room at 4 o'clock in the morning. You just hear a snatch of music, and then you try to construct the whole from the fragment. But that's my experience of how poems begin. And my primary responsibility is to try to find that moment of origin and intuit what the full poem should be. And when it's done, to make it as clear as possible, that's where craft and work comes in, and rewriting, to make it as clear as possible. But after that, it's nothing to do with me. I don't feel any responsibility to anybody, least of all to myself, once the poem is made. I might think, well, I don't think this is a good moment to publish a particular poem, so I won't. I mean, I'd say that in theory, but it's never actually happened to me. But if I've been true to the poem, and if I've done everything I can to make the poem clear and stand on its own 2 feet, then that's my primary responsibility. If I have a different responsibility to inform myself as a moral human being, outside of the poems and in my daily life and so on, to learn about justice and kindness and so on. And inevitably, you would hope that the person you are will attract a particular kind of poem. So that's a kind of guarantee of the, if you like, the authenticity of the poem. But I cannot imagine ever writing a poem because I know, for instance, that the editor of the New Yorker likes that kind of poem, and if I do that, I might get a poem published in the New Yorker. I can't imagine ever doing it. In fact, if I did that, I'd ask somebody to press a pillow over my face when I'm asleep and keep it there till I stop breathing. You know, I would be so ashamed of myself if I did that. This is why nobody reads me. You know? And it's a terrible temptation for young poets to write to the fashion of the moment, whatever it is, to write to the politics of the moment, the aesthetic of the moment. My experience has been, and getting older now, is the awkward ones are usually the ones who win through in the end. It's nearly always the awkward ones, the ones who don't necessarily always agree with what they've written, who aren't sure of what it means. I've constantly had the experience of 10, 15, 20 years after writing a poem saying, oh, I didn't realize it meant that. You know, which is why the ancient compact, we spoke of this last night, the ancient compact between scholars and poets is so important. You know? Because I'd say all of the poets I respect and admire and like have the same experience. They're constantly being surprised years later by something they wrote. They didn't hear because they find a new meaning in it. And if you grant that, then you have to say that's something written deliberately to produce an effect. You can call it verse, you can call it something else, but please don't call it a poem, because it's not autonomous. I don't know if I've really properly answered your question, have I?
At some point you have. Thank you very much.
Are you looking as if you'd like your room back?
there are any questions, feel free to ask them.
5, 4, 3, 2.
Okay.
Just in
Okay.
time.
Sorry. Not a question, maybe a request. Can we have one more poem just to close the meeting? Political one, preferably. Really short one.
Let me see.
We don't really have another translation, but we can read one in the original version if Theo would be willing to read it out.
Thank you.
Can we have a follow-up request, please?
Yes.
We also have some poems in Irish, and you were educated in Irish, so can you read one in Irish too, please?
Right.
Perfect, thank you.
The first verse of my favorite one in Irish. Okay. And this chacht an arig big an ládal can sheen, staration of féle breed ar doig me my call, o churis me chian en is stopping me chuide, geshasa me hies, in our chunte wio. A glark in a wirish bes me an kealiga, is a mala tel hies the tosoi me hall, is da menshiem hiasa, the garth larma ruina, the moch an ishtium, is the bang or ishto. Now that the spring has come, I will raise up my sail, Mr. Now with the spring coming, the days are beginning to stretch. And after the feast of breed, I will raise up my sail. The first night I will be in Claremorris, and on the next night in Bala I will begin to drink. And if I were standing at the right center of my own people, age would fall away from me, and I would be young again. It's written quite blindly afterwards. It's a lovely language, isn't it? Oh, Jesus, yeah. Could you hear that at the back? Huh? Do I need to do it again? All right, just the Irish, right? Okay. And this teacht an arig beg an ládal can sína is taréis na féle bríide ar doig me me cheol ó churas me cheanna ní stoppig me chuithe gus seasid me hias I lor chunta mo jo. I glár clinamuris bes me an céadíthe is bemala tef hiasta tosoi me gol. Is da meng siem hiasaf I gjart larn marina. De mochen is diem is the veng or is oak. Age would fall away from me and I would be young again. De mochen is diem is the veng or is oak. Such beautiful melodic language. It's the oldest existing Indo-European language. In direct line of descent from Sanskrit. They didn't know that, did you? A request. Let me see. Well, do you mind if it's not a political point?
No, not at all. Of course.
What about the last one in this poem? Because I found it really.
Cape Horn?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. She's chosen.
Perfect. I trust.
Every now and then it all gets too much when I get into a boat and sail across an ocean. And the second last trip I did was from South America to South Africa. And it clears the head, you know. 35 days of pure fear and terror in the South Atlantic in winter. And but I got to sail around Cape Horn, which is not something I ever thought I'd find myself doing or saying. And this poem is called Cape Horn. And we will stop at it. And I want to thank you for your patience and the kindness of your expressions, and again your patience. And thank you to the house for the hospitality, and Katarzyna, of course, and to my Kazimierz gone again. He keeps having to go out with the child every time I want to thank him. Well, I'll thank him by proxy again, and thank you. And for those terrifying questions, which I managed to sort of slightly evade. Cape Horn. I hand over the wheel and step aside. I close my eyes. I think of you all. I open my arms to this wind from the icebound south, sucked upward, then bent towards long-imagined Africa by the looming weight of the continent up above. I feel the boat heel and dig deep as we drive on. I want to say, as we crash through broken waters, I will be gone as these under the keel are gone, that we ride the wind a moment only. But the better truth is this: time is eternal now. There never was, nor ever will be, an end to voyaging. I hope. Thank you all very much. Thank you so much. Dziękuję, dziękuję.
Brief word for me, because I would like to thank Theo for coming here to Kraków, attending the festival, agreeing to this meeting, answering all my difficult, complex, too long questions. And thank you to all of you, people who came here and were willing to listen, both to the poems we have read and to the questions we tried to tackle. I'm so incredibly grateful for your patience, for your interest in the topics we tried to cover. And I hope you won't regret attending this meeting. And yeah, I hope there will be a lot of interesting meetings as well in the course of this festival. Yeah. And thank you once again.